I had just moved into a small, aging apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. After years of living in noisy dormitories and cramped shared spaces, I was finally on my own, and the prospect of solitude was appealing. The building was a bit old-fashioned, and the hallways smelled faintly of dust and age, but it had character. Plus, the rent was affordable, and the area was quiet. What more could I ask for? The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking boxes and settling into my new place, enjoying the peace and quiet I hadn't had in a long time. The apartment had creaky floors and an ancient yet functional kitchen, but overall it felt like home. The only thing that seemed slightly odd was the apartment next door. It had been empty for the past few weeks, but I hadn't thought much of it. The whole building was old, and tenants tended to come and go. I assumed that whoever was moving in would be like the others, just a quiet person going about their business. That assumption changed a few days later when I started hearing strange noises. It began quietly at first, just soft thuds or bumps, like someone was moving furniture. I didn't think much of it. New tenants always make noise while settling in. But as the days passed, the noises became more frequent and varied. The thuds turned into scraping sounds, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. There was the occasional thump, followed by silence, and then faint, shuffling footsteps. What unnerved me, however, was how the sounds always seemed to happen at the 10 p.m. I would be in my bed, just about to drift off to sleep, and then I'd hear it. Soft, steady pacing back and forth, like someone was walking in the apartment next door, never stopping, just endlessly pacing the room. It wasn't the type of noise that would naturally occur during the day. It was deliberate, almost as if someone was trying to keep themselves occupied during the night. The first time it really got to me was on the third night. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. I tried to ignore the pacing, telling myself it was just the new neighbor getting settled. But then I heard something strange. A low, almost inaudible murmur. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out words, but it was definitely there. A low voice, as if someone was talking to themselves. I didn't move. I didn't want to. The thought of someone whispering, talking to themselves in the middle of the night made my skin crawl. But I tried to reason with myself. Maybe they were just talking on the phone or watching TV. It was easy to dismiss it all, but then came the worst part. The pacing stopped, and then a sharp, loud knock on the walls separating our apartments. Knock, knock, knock. 3 quick raps. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a random noise. It was as if someone had deliberately struck the wall. I stared at the wall for a moment, unsure what to do. My mind raced. What was that? Was it the neighbor? But who knocks on the wall in the middle of the night? I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe they'd dropped something, or maybe the wall was just thin. Still, the thought lingered. Why would someone knock like that? I lay there for hours, wide awake, listening to the occasional faint scrape and shuffle. Eventually I fell asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, I felt uneasy. The apartment felt different, like there was a presence in the air. I tried to push the feeling away, chalking it up to being new in the building. The next few days were more of the same. The pacing continued at night, each time a little louder, more frantic, as if the person next door was growing restless. Then came the whispering again, faint but constant, always accompanied by the unsettling sound of movement. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something about it felt wrong. The noises weren't normal. There was something deliberate about them, like the person in the apartment was trying to get my attention. I decided to take action. I couldn't stand the thought of lying awake every night, listening to the pacing and whispers. I needed to confront the neighbor, ask them if everything was all right. I figured maybe they were just going through something, and the noises were simply the result of a restless mind. I was hoping for a simple explanation, something logical that would put my anxiety to rest. I knocked on the door one evening after work. I had rehearsed what I was going to say in my head, something polite and non-confrontational, just asking if they were okay, mentioning the noises I'd been hearing. When the door opened, I was taken aback. A man stood there, probably in his early 40s. He had an average build, with dark hair that was slightly messy, as if he hadn't bothered to style it. He looked tired, exhausted, really, and his eyes were bloodshot, like he hadn't been sleeping well. His clothes were simple, a hoodie and jeans, but there was an oddness to him, something off that I couldn't quite place. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't seem entirely genuine. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm your neighbor from next door. I wanted to check in and see if everything's okay. I've been hearing some noises at night, like pacing and some light scraping. I just wanted to make sure you're all right." He stared at me for a moment, blinking slowly. Then he nodded. "Oh yeah, I'm fine. It's just, I've been having some trouble sleeping lately," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "I tend to move around a lot when I can't sleep. Sorry if it's been disturbing you." I nodded, trying to keep the conversation light. "No, it's fine. Just wanted to check. It's been a little unsettling, that's all." "I hope you're doing all right." He looked at me, his gaze lingering for a moment too long before responding. "I'll be fine. Thanks for checking. I'll try to keep it quieter." But his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Something about him didn't sit right with me. It was like he was hiding something, but I couldn't figure out what. The unease I felt during the conversation lingered as I left, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as I walked back to my apartment. That night, the pacing began again, just like the nights before, but this time it was different. It was more erratic, almost frantic. The knocking came again, louder, harder this time. Knock, knock, knock. It felt like a warning. My heart raced as I lay in bed, eyes wide open, straining to listen. The murmurs returned, faint whispers on the other side of the wall. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just scratched the surface of something much darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The strange noises, the whispers, the pacing, all of it had become too much to ignore. I'd never been one to jump to conclusions, but the more I heard, the more I was convinced that something wasn't right with my neighbor. The man I had briefly spoken to seemed to be hiding something. His tired eyes, his strange reaction when I mentioned the noises. It all felt too off to be coincidental. That night, as I lay in bed, the pacing began again. But this time it was different. The sounds were louder and more hurried, almost frantic. The constant movement on the other side of the wall seemed to increase in intensity, as if the person next door was trapped in some kind of restless loop. The rhythm of their footsteps was irregular, more like the desperate pacing of someone who couldn't find peace. It felt as though something was pushing them to move faster, almost like an invisible force, driving them to keep walking, over and over again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The murmuring started, soft at first, but then grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just talking now, it was pleading. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the desperation in the voice. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat prickling on the back of my neck. It was the kind of noise that kept you up at night, the kind that burrowed deep into your thoughts. making you question everything around you. At 3 a.m., the knocking came again, 3 sharp, deliberate raps against the wall. Knock, knock, knock. This time the knock echoed through the apartment, almost like it was coming from inside my own room. My body froze, and for a moment I couldn't even breathe. I was paralyzed with fear. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling that came with it. It was as if someone was trying to get my attention, to draw me into whatever darkness they were living in. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront him. I had to know what was happening. The next morning, I mustered the courage to knock on his door again. The early light filtered through the hallways, casting long shadows on the walls, but I still felt uneasy. When I reached his door, I hesitated for a moment, trying to steady my nerves. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my fingers trembling, but I took a deep breath and knocked. The door opened after a few moments, and the same man greeted me, though this time his face was more drawn, his eyes darker, like he hadn't slept at all. His clothes were disheveled and he had a faint odor about him, like he hadn't been taking care of himself. His smile was more forced this time, like he was trying too hard to appear normal. Is everything all right? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The noises, they've been getting worse. The pacing, the knocking, it's really disturbing. He blinked slowly at me, like the question caught him off guard. His lips parted, but no words came out for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Almost too quiet. I told you before, I just have trouble sleeping sometimes. It didn't sit right with me. There was something off in his tone, like he was avoiding my gaze on purpose. His eyes kept flickering to the side, darting nervously toward the hallway, as if he didn't want to be seen talking to me. I pushed further. I don't mean to intrude, but this is getting a little out of hand. I don't think it's just trouble sleeping. It feels like you're struggling with something. At that, his face shifted. The forced smile disappeared, replaced by an expression that was almost unreadable. For a moment, he seemed to be considering what to say, his gaze drifting to the floor. His voice dropped lower, like he was afraid someone might overhear. I can't explain it, he whispered, almost to himself. It's not something you would understand. Before I could respond, he abruptly stepped back, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in my ears, and I was left standing in the hallway, feeling like I had just touched something that should have remained hidden. That night, I heard it again. The pacing, the whispers. It was more intense than ever. But this time, something was different. The noises seemed to be coming from all around me. The air felt heavy, as though the walls were closing in. The murmurings weren't just whispers anymore. They were words, broken and slurred, as if someone was speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. And the pacing, it didn't stop. It was as if the person next door had been walking for hours, their footsteps relentless, never tiring. Suddenly, the knocking returned. 3 quick raps, followed by a pause, then more rapping. But this time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from inside my apartment. Knock, knock, knock. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the bedroom wall right behind me, just a few feet away. The walls weren't thick enough to hide anything, and the knocking seemed too loud, too close, as if the person next door had found their way into my apartment. I rushed out of my bedroom and into the hallway, my breath shallow. I didn't know what I was expecting. whether the neighbor had somehow found his way into my apartment or whether I was simply losing my mind. But when I reached the door to his apartment, my hand shaking, I hesitated. The door was ajar. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, and for a moment I considered just turning around and running. But something forced me forward. I pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges loud in the silence of the night. The apartment was dark, but there was a faint light flickering from within. I could see a figure standing in the center of the room, facing away from me. His back was hunched, and he was muttering something under his breath. As I stepped closer, the light flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He turned slowly, his face as pale as a ghost. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his pupils dilated, and his skin seemed as though it had been stretched too tight over his bones. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, maybe longer. His lips curled into a twisted, unnerving smile. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice low and raspy. "You shouldn't have come to my door." I froze, my stomach dropping. Suddenly the world seemed to go dark, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. A low laugh echoed from behind me. Another voice, one I hadn't heard before. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only darkness. The door slammed shut behind me, and that was the last thing I remember before waking up in my apartment. The sound of the pacing and whispers gone. The walls were silent, but deep down, I knew whatever I had encountered that night, it was not something I would ever forget. And neither would my neighbor.